There is a particular taxonomy of lies that long marriages generate. At the bottom of the taxonomy are the harmless ones, the enthusiastic compliments about meals that were merely adequate, the manufactured interest in a subject that does not genuinely interest you, the small frictions smoothed over for the sake of an evening. These are the mortar of ordinary domestic life, and most people make their peace with them early. Further up the taxonomy are the lies of omission, the things not said, the concerns not raised, the conversations deferred week after week until the deferral itself becomes a permanent arrangement. These are more costly. They operate by silence rather than speech, which makes them harder to identify and harder to address because there is no specific statement to retract. There is only the accumulating space where the truth was not placed. And at the top of the taxonomy, the category that does the most sustained damage, precisely because it is the least dramatic, are the ordinary lies that a person tells not to deceive but to manage how they are perceived, to manage what their spouse expects of them, to manage the version of themselves that exists inside the marriage, keeping it slightly more flattering, slightly more capable, slightly more certain than the version that actually wakes up each morning and moves through the world. These are the lies that Calvin Reese had been telling his wife Paulette for 14 years, not about anything large, about the small, daily texture of who he was, his work, his decisions, his certainties, his fears. The ongoing editorial revision of a man who had never been fully comfortable being fully known. Paulette Reese had known for most of those 14 years. She had known the way long-married women know things, not through evidence gathered systematically, but through the accumulated weight of small inconsistencies, the particular quality of a hesitation before certain answers, the way a story changed slightly between its first telling and its third. She had known and she had said nothing, for reasons she understood clearly and had been reassessing incrementally for the past 2 years. She stopped saying nothing on a Thursday afternoon in September, on the Family Feud stage, when Steve Harvey asked her a question she had been answering privately for 14 years, and she decided, for the first time, to answer it out loud. The audience's reaction has been described, by people who were present, as the most sustained single response they had witnessed in years of attending live tapings. Not the loudest. The most sustained, the kind of response that keeps going because each new wave of it is fed by something different. First recognition, then laughter, then the particular silence of a room processing something that has just become real, then finally the applause that means, yes, someone said the thing. Paulette Reese was 48 years old and had the specific quality of a woman who has spent a long time observing the world more carefully than the world has observed her, a quality that tends to produce, in people who maintain it long enough, a particular kind of authority, not the loud authority of people who insist on being heard. The quiet authority of people who have been paying attention so long that, when they do speak, what they say tends to be correct. She had grown up in Columbia, South Carolina, the second of 3 daughters raised by a mother who had worked as a court reporter for 28 years and a father who had been a high school history teacher for 32. Both of them were, in their different ways, professional listeners, people whose work required them to receive and record and interpret what other people said with care and precision. Paulette had inherited this from both of them without dilution. She heard things. She remembered them. She noticed when the current version of a story did not quite align with the previous one, and she filed the discrepancy in the place where she filed such things, which was a place that had been filling steadily for 14 years. She had worked as a paralegal for 19 years at a firm that handled family law cases, which had given her professional exposure to the full range of what happens when the editorial revisions people make to their own characters inside a marriage accumulate past the point of management. She was not cynical about marriage as a result of this exposure. She was realistic, which is a different thing. She understood, from the inside of other people's failing arrangements, the specific mechanisms by which a marriage that contains too much managed perception and not enough honest accounting tends to move toward a certain destination. She had been watching the mechanisms operate in her own marriage for several years and had been deciding, incrementally, what to do about them. She had decided at some point in the months before the Family Feud application that she was going to stop deciding and simply start being honest, not dramatically, not through confrontation or ultimatum, simply by telling the truth when the occasion presented itself, the way she would have told it years ago if she had not learned, somewhere in the early years of her marriage, to calibrate her honesty to what Calvin could comfortably receive. She was done calibrating. She was going to answer the questions she was asked. Calvin Reese was 51 years old and was, in most of the ways that his professional and social world could assess, a man who had things under control. He ran a small but profitable financial planning practice in Colombia, which required him to project confidence and certainty as professional tools. Clients do not pay for uncertainty, and the performance of knowing what you are doing is inseparable from the work of actually doing it in a field where human psychology is half the service. He was good at this. He had been good at it for long enough that the performance and the reality had, in many domains, merged. He was genuinely competent. He was also in the specific way of people who have spent decades managing how they are perceived, genuinely uncertain about where the performance ended and the person began. At home, the performance continued by default. Not maliciously, Calvin did not think of it as performance when it was happening. He thought of it as how he communicated, which is what performance becomes when you have been doing it long enough. He overstated the certainty behind his decisions. He understood the outcome of situations better in retrospect than he had at the time, and presented his retrospective understanding as the understanding he had possessed throughout. He told Paulette that things were handled when they were partially handled, that he had thought about things he had not yet thought about, that situations were resolved that were still in progress. None of these were lies of malice. They were lies of self-presentation, the ongoing revision of a man maintaining, for the person closest to him, a slightly better version of himself than the one that actually existed. He had not examined this pattern with any rigor until a Thursday afternoon in September, when his wife examined it for him, in public, with the precision of a 19-year paralegal and the composure of a woman who had been ready to do exactly this for longer than the occasion had taken to arrive. The Reese family team was 5. Calvin and Paulette, their son Jordan, who was 24 and had his mother's observational intelligence and his father's surface confidence in a combination that made him effective and occasionally exhausting. Their daughter Naomi, who was 21 and was finishing her junior year of college, and had the particular clarity of a young woman who has spent her entire adolescence watching her parents' marriage closely enough to have opinions about it that she kept mostly to herself. And Paulette's younger brother Marcus, who was 44 and had known Calvin for 15 years, and had his own carefully maintained views about the man his sister had married, which he exercised with the discipline of a person who has learned that loyalty to a sibling does not require the continuous expression of every observation. Marcus had said, when Paulette called to invite him to join the Family Feud team, "Is this the trip where something finally gets said?" Paulette had said she did not know what he meant. Marcus had said, "Yes, you do." She had not disputed this. They flew to Los Angeles on a Wednesday, 2 days before the taping. The day before was warm and good, a day of being a family away from home, which always has a slightly altered quality, the ordinary frictions temporarily suspended by the novelty of a shared location. Calvin was in excellent form, which he always was when the context was new, generous, attentive, the version of himself that had made Paulette fall in love with him, and that still appeared reliably enough that she had never stopped recognizing it. Naomi took photographs of everything. Jordan talked to strangers at every opportunity. Marcus watched Calvin with the attentive quiet of a man who has been watching someone for 15 years and is still updating his assessment. The morning of the taping, over breakfast, Calvin told the family that he had done some research on Family Feud strategies and had a few thoughts. Paulette listened to his thoughts. They were, in the main, reasonable and mostly accurate, and presented with the additional layer of certainty that Calvin's self-presentation always added. She listened with the attentive patience she brought to Calvin's certainties, which she had been bringing to them for 14 years, and said, "That sounds good." Then she drank her coffee and thought about what she was going to do with the day. The Family Feud studio had the quality it always had, a warm, organized brightness designed to produce the best possible version of whatever a family brought through its doors. The Reese family moved into it comfortably. Calvin immediately established himself in the room with the professional ease of a man who has spent decades making new rooms feel familiar. He introduced himself to production staff, made the warm-up comedian laugh, and moved through the pre-taping period with the smooth competence of someone operating in a context that suited his particular strengths. Paulette moved alongside him, greeting people with the attentive, specific warmth that made brief encounters feel like genuine exchanges. Jordan was immediately good-natured with everyone. Naomi was observant and selective in the way of a young woman who has learned to take the measure of a room before committing to it. Marcus stood near the back and watched everything with the quiet thoroughness of a man updating a long-running assessment. Steve Harvey came out and worked his way through the introductions with the warm, genuine professionalism that had made him one of the best at what he did for over a decade. He spent time with Jordan, who gave him immediate and easy material. He found Naomi interesting and told her so, and she received the compliment with the composed directness of a young woman who had learned it from her mother. He was charmed by Marcus in the way he was always charmed by people who were not performing anything for him. Then he reached Calvin and Paulette. Calvin shook his hand with the polished confidence of a man who shakes a great many hands professionally and has developed a particular quality of handshake, firm, brief, accompanied by direct eye contact and a smile that says, "I'm glad to be here and I intend to be good company." Steve responded to it the way he responded to competent performance, warmly and with mild curiosity about what was underneath it. He turned to Paulette. "Paulette Reese," he said, "tell me about yourself." "I am a paralegal," she said. 19 years in family law." Steve absorbed this. "Family law," he said. "So you have spent 19 years watching marriages." "Watching them," Paulette said, "and reading the documents that explain how they ended." Steve Harvey looked at her for a long moment with the expression he wore when someone had just told him something that required a beat to receive properly. Then he looked at Calvin, then he looked back at Paulette. "This is going to be an interesting afternoon," he said. "I believe so," said Paulette. Calvin laughed. It was a good laugh, warm and easy. He was not nervous. He had no particular reason at this point in the afternoon to be nervous. He did not yet know what his wife had decided to do with the day. The Reese family was matched against the Coleman family from Nashville, a confident, quick five-person team anchored by a 54-year-old mother named Joyce, who had the buzzer speed of someone who had spent 3 decades as an emergency dispatcher, and for whom fast, accurate responses under pressure were simply the default setting. The game was close and competitive from the first question. Calvin played well. He was fast and on the questions that fell within his domain, accurate, the practical domestic categories, the things a man does on weekends, the household knowledge that accumulated over 14 years of shared life. He had the competitive energy of a man who does not enjoy losing anything he can reasonably win, and the game drew it out cleanly. The audience liked him. People in rooms generally liked Calvin Reese. He had spent his career engineering exactly that outcome. Jordan was quick and occasionally brilliant. He hit a #1 answer in the second round that made Steve Harvey point at him with a specific gesture reserved for answers that could not have been predicted. Naomi was steady and precise, the way her mother was steady and precise, contributing cleanly when the opportunity came without requiring the opportunity to come frequently. Marcus buzzed in once in the 4th round with an answer that was incorrect, but delivered with such authority that the reveal produced the particular laughter that incorrect answers delivered confidently always generate. Paulette won, the main game for them. In the 5th round, with the Rieses needing to clear the board to hold their lead, she stepped to the podium and named 4 answers in sequence with the methodical efficiency of a woman who spent her professional life organizing complex information under time pressure. The board cleared. The Reese family won by 23 points. Calvin pulled her into an embrace during the celebration that was warm and genuine. He was proud of her, in the full and real way that he was proud of her when she did something publicly well, which was a form of love she had never questioned even when she was questioning other things. She received it the same way she received everything from Calvin, fully and with a clear eye. Steve gathered the family at center stage. 2 players, 5 questions each, 200 points to win $20,000. The family discussion began and Calvin said with the natural confidence of a man who expected his logic to land as it usually did, "I think Paulette and I are the obvious choices. She goes first, I close it out." There was no objection to this. It was reasonable, Paulette nodded. The decision was made in 8 seconds, but as the family moved toward the backstage area, Steve Harvey held up a hand. "Before you go," he said pleasantly, "I have a question for Calvin." He turned to face him. "Calvin, you are a financial planner. You deal in facts and projections every day. How do you feel about your accuracy? Generally speaking, are you an accurate man?" Calvin smiled the smile of a man receiving a question whose answer he considers obvious. "I'd say so," he said. "I try to be precise. It is what my clients rely on." "Paulette," Steve said, turning to her with the same pleasant tone, "would you agree with that assessment?" Paulette looked at her husband. She looked at Steve Harvey. She took the precise, brief pause of a woman who has decided to answer honestly and is simply organizing the honesty into its most useful form. "Calvin," she said, "is very good at projecting confidence in his assessments. Whether the assessments are accurate is a separate question." The room received this. Not with a gasp, it was too precise for a gasp. with the collective held breath quality of an audience that has just been given a very clear signal about the kind of afternoon this is going to be. Calvin's smile held. It was slightly more effortful than the previous one. Steve Harvey looked between them with the expression of a man who has been waiting for something and has just confirmed it is coming. "All right," Steve said. "Let's play." Paulette stepped to the fast money podium with the composure of a woman who had been making decisions in high-stakes contexts for 19 years and understood the relationship between clarity of mind and quality of outcome. Steve asked her to name something a wife knows about her husband that he thinks is a secret. She said, "How unsure he really is," and the board turned. Number one answer, 44 points. The room made a sound, not a laugh, something more internal than a laugh. Recognition. Steve asked her to name a word a wife uses to describe her husband to her friends. She said, "complicated." Number two answer, 27 points. He asked her to name something a husband says to end an argument that does not actually end it. She said, "I said I was sorry." Number one answer, 41 points, and Steve Harvey turned slightly toward the camera and back in the way he does when something has landed precisely where it was aimed. The fourth question, name a lie husbands tell most often. Paulette said, "That everything is fine." Number one answer, 38 points. 150 points after 4 questions. The room was fully engaged in the way that rooms become engaged when they have understood that what they are watching is not only a game. The fifth question, name something a wife does when she knows her husband is not being fully honest with her. Paulette Reese looked at the question. She looked at Steve Harvey. She looked for the first time during her fast money round at Calvin, who was standing at the side of the stage. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked back at Steve Harvey and said, in the clear, level voice of a woman who has been preparing this answer for 14 years, "She waits, she documents, she loves him anyway, and eventually she tells him that she knows." The audience erupted. That is the only accurate word for what happened. Not a laugh, not applause, but a full, genuine eruption of recognition and release. The sound of 200 people encountering something that had been living in their own experience, and had just been named out loud with surgical precision by a woman who had never raised her voice. Steve Harvey put his hand on his chest and took 3 steps backward and stayed there for a long moment, looking at Paulette with the expression he wore only when something had genuinely reached him. The board turned. Waits and WATCHESSDAYS quiet, number one answer, 43 points, 193 points. The second highest single-player fast money score of the season, and the least relevant fact in the room, the audience had not settled. That was the remarkable thing. 2 minutes after Paulette's fifth answer, the response was still running. Not at peak volume, but in the sustained, rolling way of a room that keeps encountering the answer from new angles and responding to each one. The woman in the third row who said something to her companion and laughed. The older man in the 7th row who was nodding slowly with his arms folded and his eyes closed. The group of women in the back left who had been sitting quietly all afternoon and were now leaning toward each other in animated conversation. Steve Harvey let it run. He was a professional, but he was also a man who understood when to let a room have what it needed, and this room needed time with what had just been placed in it. When it had settled enough for words to work, he turned to Paulette and spoke with the quiet directness he used when he was not performing anything. "Paulette," he said, "I want to make sure I understand the full answer. She waits, she documents, she loves him anyway, and eventually she tells him that she knows." He paused. "Is that a general answer or is that a personal one?" Paulette held his gaze. "Both," she said. The room responded again, the specific sound of people who had suspected this and are now confirmed. Steve Harvey turned to look at Calvin. Calvin was standing at the side of the stage with the stillness of a man who has just had something explained to him publicly that was previously only known privately. His expression was not defensive. It was not angry. It was the expression of a man receiving a truth that he had half known for a long time and is encountering now in its complete form, in a room full of witnesses with no available avenue of management. "Calvin," Steve said, his voice even, "I think your wife just told you something." "She did," Calvin said. His voice was quieter than it had been all day. "I want to ask you something," Steve said, "and I want you to answer me the way your wife just answered me, straight, no revision. Can you do that?" A beat, then yes. "Do you know what she is talking about?" Calvin looked at his wife across the stage. The distance between them was perhaps 20 feet. It felt to the people watching like something considerably more navigable than it had an hour ago. "Yes," he said. "I know what she is talking about." Steve Harvey turned to address the room with the directness he used when the thing he was about to say was something he had thought about for a long time and was prepared to stand behind completely. "I want to talk about the kind of lie that Paulette just described," he said, "because it is the kind that people talk about least and live with most. It is not the dramatic lie. It is not the affair or the hidden debt or the catastrophic deception that ends things in a night. It is the ongoing, daily, low-level revision that a person makes to how they present themselves to the person closest to them. The version of themselves that is slightly more certain, slightly more competent, slightly more resolved than the version that actually wakes up each morning. The lies that say, I have this handled, I know what I am doing, everything is fine. He paused. Most people who tell these lies do not think of themselves as liars. Because the lies are small and because they are told in service of a self-image rather than a scheme. They are not designed to harm. They are designed to protect the teller from being seen as uncertain or inadequate or afraid. And the problem is that the person you are protecting yourself from is your spouse, the person who is supposed to know you, the person you chose specifically to know you, and you have spent years making sure they know the edited version instead. His voice was steady and without judgment, which gave it more force than accusation would have. And here is what Paulette just told you the cost of that is. The cost is that your wife, who loves you, who has been watching you clearly for 14 years, who has the professional training to read between lines for a living, has been doing exactly what she described. Waiting, documenting, loving you anyway, and biding her time until the right moment to tell you that she knows. That moment, he said with the smallest possible smile, is apparently now. The room stood up. Not gradually, all at once, the way rooms stand when something has been said that required standing for. Calvin was looking at his wife. Paulette was looking at her husband. And in the specific, irreducible privacy of two people looking at each other in a room full of people, something was being communicated that the room could witness but not enter. Steve Harvey let it stand. He did not hurry toward the next thing. He stood at the center of his stage and gave the moment the respect that the moment had earned. Calvin needed 7 points from his 5 fast money questions to win $20,000. He stood at the podium with the particular quality of a man who has just had a significant portion of his self-presentation examined in public and has decided, in the real, deliberate way rather than the reflexive way, that he is going to respond to that examination with honesty rather than management. Steve asked him to name something a husband should admit to his wife more often. Calvin said without a pause, that he is scared. Number 1 answer, 41 points. He answered all 5 questions. He scored 54 points. The Reese family finished with 247, the kind of score that wins easily and that nobody in the room was tallying with any particular attention, because the score was not what the afternoon had been about. The board illuminated, and the celebration was warm and genuine, a family that had just been through something real together, and had arrived on the other side of it with the win that the day also contained. Jordan lifted his arms. Naomi hugged her mother with the full, uncomplicated intensity of a young woman who had been watching her mother be underestimated for her entire adult life and had just watched the accounting be squared. Marcus stood close to his sister and said nothing and put his hand briefly on her shoulder, and she covered it with hers for a moment, and that was the most that needed to be said between them. Calvin walked to Paulette. He did not say anything for a moment. He looked at his wife with the expression of a man encountering the full picture of something he had been seeing in partial views for 14 years. Then he said, "You have been very patient with me." It was not a question. It was an acknowledgement, plain, unembellished, delivered in the direct voice that Calvin Reese reserved for the moments when the performance was not going to serve him and he had decided to set it down. Paulette looked at him. "I have," she said. "You are worth it. But we need to talk differently than we have been." "Yes," he said. "We do." They stood there for a moment on a game show stage, two people who had just cleared something that had been sitting between them for 14 years, and what the room saw was not the end of a conflict, but the beginning of an honest conversation that had been 14 years in arriving. The audience, which had been standing, stayed standing. Some things deserve to be stood for until they are fully finished. The Reese family spent 2 more days in Lowe's Angels after the taping, which had the quality those days often have when something significant has shifted. The ordinary pleasures of a trip slightly altered in their texture, the silences between people carrying more than silences usually carry. Calvin and Paulette had their first version of the conversation that night in the hotel room, after the children had gone to their own rooms, and Marcus had said goodnight with the expression of a man who had been waiting 15 years for an evening's outcome and was satisfied with this one. The first conversation lasted 2 hours. It was not, by Paulette's account, the complete versions of conversations that have been deferred for 14 years do not arrive in a single evening. It was the beginning, the acknowledgement on Calvin's part that the pattern Paulette had named was real, and that he had known it was real, and that the knowing had coexisted with the continuing for longer than it should have. The acknowledgement, on Paulette's part, that she had chosen to absorb rather than address for reasons of her own that she was also prepared to examine. The mutual recognition, which is the most important thing that can happen in a conversation of this kind, that both of them had been managing their way around an honest accounting, and that the managing was no longer working for either of them. They were awake until 1 in the morning. They ordered room service at 11 because neither of them had eaten properly. Calvin told Paulette 3 things about his professional life that he had been presenting in revised form and had not told her in their actual form. They were not catastrophic revelations. They were ordinary uncertainties, a client situation that had been more difficult than he had indicated, a business decision he had been less confident about than he had presented, a period of professional anxiety 6 years earlier that he had described to her as resolved when it had merely attenuated. Paulette listened to all 3 with the attentive precision she brought to everything. Then she said, "I knew about the first 2. I suspected the third." Calvin looked at her. She looked back at him. It was, by his later account, the most seen he had felt by another person in many years. The episode aired on a Monday evening 6 weeks after the taping. The clip of Paulette's 5th answer circulated within the first 3 hours and had reached 14 million views before midnight. By the following morning, it was at 35 million. By the end of the week, 65 million. By the end of the month, the number had crossed 90 million, and the clip had been shared on platforms that did not typically carry game show content, reaching audiences that had no prior connection to Family Feud. The response was one of the most specifically personal the show had ever generated. People were not writing generally about being moved. They were writing about their own marriages, their own versions of the pattern Paulette had named, their own versions of the waiting and the documenting and the loving anyway. Women wrote about recognizing the description of their own experience so precisely that they had to put their phones down before continuing. Men wrote about recognizing the description of themselves in Calvin, the ongoing, unexamined editorial revision of the self presented to a spouse, and about the particular discomfort of that recognition, which was more uncomfortable than recognition of dramatic wrongdoing because it could not be dismissed as extraordinary. It was ordinary. That was exactly what made it costly. Steve Harvey's framing, specifically the passage about the person you are protecting yourself from being your spouse, the person you chose specifically to know you, was extracted and shared independently of the full clip, which is the specific form of spread that occurs when a sentence captures something that people had been trying to articulate and had not previously had the language for. It appeared in marriage counseling contexts, in professional writing about long-term partnerships, in the personal correspondence of people who had forwarded it to their partners because they could not find their own words for the same thing. It became, in the quiet and genuine way that precise truths sometimes do, part of the shared vocabulary of the people who received it. Paulette gave one interview 10 months after the broadcast to a journalist whose work she had followed for several years. She spoke for 90 minutes and gave the journalist, by her account, more than had been asked for because Paulette Reese had spent 19 years as a paralegal and knew what thorough documentation looked like and had decided to provide it. She was asked why she had said what she said on the stage. She said, "Because it was the true answer and I had decided to give true answers. I did not plan it as a statement about my marriage. I planned it as a commitment to honesty that the occasion then made specific." She was asked whether she had considered what Calvin's experience would be, receiving that answer publicly in a room full of strangers. She paused before answering. Then she said, "I thought about it. I decided that 14 years of absorbing a version of him was its own form of unkindness, requiring someone to present a revised self to you indefinitely without naming that you see the revision is not the same as accepting them. It is a form of collusion with the fiction. I was tired of the collusion." She was asked what she wanted the experience to produce. She said, without much pause, "An honest marriage, which is what we had the materials for all along and what we were not building." She was asked whether she thought they were building it now. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, slowly, with the kinds of tools that this kind of construction requires, but yes." Calvin Reese has spoken publicly about the episode twice, once in a brief response to a local business publication that covered the story, and once in a longer conversation at a men's group at his church, 8 months after the broadcast, that was later shared with his permission. At the church group, he spoke for approximately 30 minutes. He was not looking for absolution or sympathy. He was, by the account of several men who were present, trying to be honest about something in a context where honesty was the entire point of the gathering, which he had joined 3 months after the broadcast for precisely this reason. He described the pattern Paulette had named with the clarity of a man who has spent considerable time examining something from the inside. He said that the self-presentation he had maintained in his marriage was not designed to deceive Paulette, but to protect himself from the specific vulnerability of being fully known by someone he cared that much about. He said that the paradox of it, that the person he was most protecting himself from was the person he trusted most, had been visible to him for years as an abstraction, and had not become real until his wife named it out loud in a room full of strangers with the composed precision of someone who had been ready to name it for a long time. He said the experience of that moment had been unlike anything else in his adult life. Not pleasant, true. And the truth of it had been in the months since the most useful thing he had been given. He said one thing that the men in the room remembered clearly and repeated afterward. He said, "I thought that showing my wife a version of myself I was comfortable with was a form of protecting her. What it actually was a form of not trusting her with the real version. And the real version is the only one that a marriage can actually be built on. Everything else is a model." It looks like the thing, but it is not the thing. Jordan called his mother the evening the episode aired. The call lasted 40 minutes, which was the longest phone conversation they had had in several years. He asked her directly what the experience had been like to carry for 14 years. Paulette told him with the same precision she had brought to everything else. Jordan was quiet for a while after she finished. Then he said, "I want to be a better version of what Dad was than what Dad was." Paulette said she thought he was already working on it. He asked how she could tell. She said, "Because you called, and you asked the question directly. That is not nothing." Naomi did not call. She came home the weekend after the broadcast and sat in the kitchen with her mother for 3 hours, and they talked about the things that mothers and daughters talk about when the distance between what is said and what is known has been reduced by an event that neither of them planned for and both of them needed. Paulette has said that the conversation with Naomi was the one she had not known she was missing, and had been missing for years. The conversation in which her daughter saw her as a full person rather than a parent, with a full person's interior life and full person's history, and a full person's reasons for the choices she had made. They have been having versions of that conversation ever since. The $20,000 from Family Feud was divided in a conversation that began with Calvin saying, "What do you want to do with it?" A question he asked directly, without a preceding suggestion, which was noted by Paulette as among the 3 most genuinely different things he had done since the taping. They agreed on 4 uses without significant negotiation, which was itself a data point. A portion went toward a joint session with a marriage counselor, which they attended for 6 months. Not because the marriage was failing, but because both of them had decided, in the months since September, that the marriage they wanted to build was going to require the kind of structured, honest accounting that their own conversations, however improved, were not yet equipped to provide without assistance. The counselor described them, in her session notes, as unusually self-aware clients who had arrived already knowing what the problem was and requiring primarily the scaffolding to address it. They finished the 6 months with more of the scaffolding than they had started with. A portion went toward a trip that Paulette chose, a week in Charleston, where she had grown up and had not been back to properly in over a decade. They went in the spring. Calvin walked through the city with her and listened to what she knew about it, which was considerable, and asked questions he was genuinely curious about, which was the version of Calvin that had always been available and had not always been accessible. Paulette showed him the courthouse where her mother had worked for 28 years. He stood outside it and looked at it for a long time. She watched him look at it and did not fill the silence, because some silences are full rather than empty, and she had learned, across 14 years of marriage and 10 months of an improved one, to tell the difference. Calvin's practice is doing well. He has made 3 changes to how he communicates with Paulette about his professional life, changes that are, individually, small, and collectively, the structural difference between a marriage built on a model and a marriage built on the actual thing. He tells her when he is uncertain. He reports outcomes accurately rather than retrospectively. He says, "I do not know yet," when he does not know yet, which turns out to be something he can say without the sky falling, which is information he has needed for a long time and is making use of now. Paulette still works in family law. She has, in the months since the broadcast, developed a small reputation among her colleagues as someone worth consulting when a case involves the specific, cumulative pattern of low-level misrepresentation within a marriage, because she has the professional training to identify it and the personal experience to understand it from the inside, both of which, in combination, produce a clarity that is difficult to replicate. She does not discuss the Family Feud episode at work. She does not need. The clarity speaks for itself. She said in the final passage of her interview that the thing she most wanted to be understood about the afternoon was not what she had called out, but why she had finally called it out. She said, "I did not say what I said because I was angry. I was not angry. I said it because I was done accepting a partial version of my husband when the full version was available and was worth having. 14 years is a long time to wait. It is also not too long. The truth arrived in time. That is the part that matters. It arrived in time, under studio lights in front of 200 strangers in the form of a 5-question survey and a woman who had decided to answer honestly. That is an unusual delivery mechanism for a marital reckoning. But the truth has never been particular about its roots. It simply arrives eventually if the person carrying it is finally ready to set it down. Paulette Reese was ready. The audience reacted because they recognized what readiness looks like, and they had been waiting in their own quiet ways for someone to show them. If Paulette's words reached something in you, if her patience, her precision, and her honesty reminded you of a truth you have been carrying or a conversation you have been deferring, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Share this with someone who is ready to hear it. These are the stories that change things. Hit the notification bell so you never miss one.